Hope the preacher's got something good to talk about, because if you don't, I ain't gonna stay awake very well. Glad to see everybody back this evening, of course. We talked about faith a lot. You know, pretty much all of the lessons faith sit on in one way or another. I had a lesson on it a few months ago about the things that faith is. Faith is, I don't know how to say it, but it's more than just it's more than just faith. It's more than a state of being. It's more than having faith. It's such a complicated, it's not the word, but you know, there's so much more to it than just itself. It's a lot of the time it's an action, and that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit. Is more acts of faith as anything. But what makes it even more faith, I guess, that I'm trying to kind of say is, as it's not necessarily even the conscious act of it, is it is just something you do, the same as breathing or walking or chewing when you're eating kind of thing. It just really becomes, as we practice our faith, it just becomes a part of us. Kind of found a few examples of something along those lines. I feel like, you know, examples we have in the early part of Genesis. You know, after between Adam and Eve and the flood, the accounts we have here, you know, we somewhat get the impression that in the early days of the earth, God was more among us. He wasn't just speaking through prophets and visions and things. Before Noah's time, He was more amongst us. And you know, one of the examples I use for that is back when which Enoch, which I spoke with him a few lessons ago. Enoch was one of two people that I can think of off the top of my head that didn't actually suffer death, suffer the pain of death. They were Enoch and Elijah, the prophet, were taken without suffering death. But Enoch was, yes, he was Noah's great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather, I guess you'd say. And it says in, looking in Genesis chapter 5, verse 22, that Enoch walked with God 300 years. I guess verse 21, when he was 65, he became the father of Methuselah, which, as you know, most of us know, it's one of those little trivia facts or something, I guess you'd say, that Methuselah was, to our knowledge, the oldest living person ever. He lived to be 969 years old, which another little side fact of that is, if you count the years from Noah's birth to when the flood happened, Methuselah died the year of the flood. Did he die in the flood or just die right around it? Don't know. Not for us to know, I guess. But I just thought that was very interesting. Anyway, but Enoch walked with God for 300 years after he became the father of man. And I think we tend to think of that in the sense of, just being a very faithful, devout person. I would equate that to it. But I would also venture to think that in these days, he could have literally walked with God, had a more of a, person-to-person type relationship with God. And the point of that is, did it still take a level of faith for Enoch to be so close to God that God even didn't let him suffer the pain of death? God literally took him from the earth, as we see in Genesis on down in verse 24. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. So, but that still, as we all know, even personal relationships that we have still take a level of faithfulness. And I would compare that to a relationship with a spouse. There is a level of faithfulness that goes along with that you're faithful to your spouse. And so, even though Enoch was literally walking with God to the point God took him up into heaven, straight from earth, without having to suffer the pain of death, he still had to have a level of faith, a level of faithfulness with him. And kind of continue with that, we see in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, when God says that my spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he is also flesh, nevertheless his days shall be 120 years. And this is where God's referring to how long until he destroys the earth with the flood. But what he's saying here is, when you look at we see the word strive, and when we reference that to the old text that the Bible is translated from, that is also Greek for to remain, or to abide, or to dwell, which is what gives me the impression that God used to dwell more on the earth among mankind. But at this point, men have become too evil for God to be able to be around them anymore. As you see up in chapter 6, verse 1, when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, sons of God saw beautiful daughters, and men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves whom they chose. And then later on in verse 5, then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So we know that God can't stand to be amongst that kind of sin. But then, as we know, down in verse 9, Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his time, and Noah walked with God. So I take this to mean that Noah also had a very more of a personal relationship with God. And Noah was around 500 years old, as we see back in chapter 5, verse 32 at this time. And so whenever God instructed Noah to build the ark, yes, he had a personal relationship with God, and God instructed him to do this thing. Wouldn't that still take a huge level of faith, of just knowing that this is what needs to happen? Because we don't see that when God told Noah to make yourself an ark, told him what kind of wood to make it out of, told him how to build it. It says down in verse 22 of chapter 6, thus Noah did, according to all that God had commanded him, so he did. You don't hear Noah arguing with him, pleading with him, asking him, why do I need to do this? God told him to do it, and he did it. And that takes a huge level of faith, even though God was speaking directly to him, commanding him this thing to do. Because as we know, even Moses was obstinate sometimes when God would instruct him on things to do, and even argued with God on occasion. But Noah just did it, knowing, essentially having that reflex of faith that God knows what he's doing. And again, we know it took Noah 100 years to build the ark, as we see. Again, I referenced he was 500 years old when God instructed him to build the ark. And as we see in chapter 7, verse 6, Noah was 600 years old when the flood water came upon the earth. That's a lot of faith, even for having a personal relationship with God. Another good example of faith is when Abraham, he was actually still an Abram before God had renamed him Abraham. Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, that Abraham's faith was so much that it became his righteousness. As we see in that verse, it says, then he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness, he being God. That's the level of faith that Abraham had. After God had spoken to him in a vision, telling him he'd bring him a son. And then we also know the level of Abraham's faith down in Genesis chapter 22. As we all know the story of when God told Abraham to take Isaac, because Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And that's something that escapes my mind a lot. And I know they're hardly accurate half the time probably, but we see the little pictures and the Bible stories growing up as kids, and used to have the flannel grounds or the slideshow kind of things. And all my memories of Abraham depict him as a younger man, and when I say younger, I mean he's probably, middle age. I've never seen him portrayed as an older man, as a 100-year-old man. And again, this is when Isaac was born, and just by the context, the content of the text here in chapter 22 gives me the impression that Isaac is probably, just guessing, between 5 and 8 years old somewhere. He may be 10. We don't know exactly how old he was, but we know he was old enough to know what was going on, because in chapter 22, verse 7, it says, Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the two of them walked on together. So Isaac was old enough to know that they were going to do a sacrifice and that they needed the sacrificial lamb, essentially. But to go back to Abraham's faith, and back in chapter 22, verse 2, God said, take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and took two of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. And he split wood for the burnt offering, and arose, and went to the place of which God had told him. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. Now, that's not to say he was not going through some sort of emotional state that we just have not been given in this text. I could only imagine he was. But given the examples we've had of people that often became hysterical in one way or another, whether it was with anger or jealousy or sadness, it's usually told us in the text that this person became overwhelmed with this emotion or another. As we even see in the gospel with Christ in the garden, when he's praying, we're told how Christ was overcome. But here it talks how Abraham was just going to do it all the way to the point that we see in verse 10. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son, but that's where the angel stopped him. Nowhere in there do we see where Abraham ever questioned or wondered. He just knew that that was what God needed him to do. And he trusted that whatever the outcome was of it, that it was what it needed to be. Another one I think of often is in 1 Samuel chapter 1. I know I've talked about Hannah before. She was Samuel's mother. She was one who had not been able to conceive. And as we know, she prayed to God for a son, and that she would give him to the Lord. And of course, God remembered her, and she conceived. So we know of her faith, but who else was there? Her husband was there too, the father of her son. We see in Samuel chapter 1, starting at verse 22, verse 21. After she had had Samuel, then the man Elkanah went up to all his household to offer the Lord the year the sacrifice to pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, I will not go up until the child is weaned. Then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord and stay there forever. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you. Remain until you have weaned him, only may the Lord confirm his word. And then, so we know he became weaned, and Hannah took him, presented him to Eli to give him to God. And then down in chapter 2, verse 11, then Elkanah went to his home at Ramah, but the boy ministered to the Lord before Eli the priest. I feel like that took some faith on his part too. That probably may not have been his firstborn son necessarily, but his only son that he had had with Hannah. And when she decided that that's what needed to go happen to Samuel, that he needed to go be a man of God and to live with Eli and become a prophet, he didn't question her one bit. He had faith that she was doing what was right. And then as we talk about Job a lot, and as Brad mentioned recently, I remember that Job didn't even really know that Satan was the one causing all the suffering for him. Yet, his faith in God never wavered. We talk about, we often refer to the patience of Job so much, but really Job's faith is something to be said for, that he had faith throughout all of it, even when when he would have thought God was the one inflicting all those troubles on him. He had faith and never lost his faith and never accused God or cursed God for what he did. And another really good example of faith I like to look to is Daniel. We know some of the stories and some of the accounts that come out of Daniel. Forgive me when I say stories. I don't mean to say stories. I try to say accounts because stories kind of sounds like it's made up. So, the accounts, we see several accounts in Daniel of faith. Daniel's level of faith was so high, as we know that Babylon came, King Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem, took a lot of them captive. And Daniel was among the youth that were taken captive back then, along with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, as we ironically more often heard him referred to as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But those were their Babylon names. Anyhow, we even see as early as when they're very first captured, the king had picked, choice youths. As we see in Daniel chapter 1, verse 4, they were looking for youths in whom there was no defect, who were good looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And so the king wanted them to polish them up, all that. Well, they had certain diet, the king's choice food, all the good stuff, essentially. But as early as that, they're just getting started, and Daniel's been handpicked along with the other three about y'all get to serve in the king's court, y'all get to have basically these special privileges. But as we see in verse 8, Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now Daniel was devout, but he did have a level of tact about him so that he knew kind of the right things to say to grant him favor. Of course, God's granting him favor as well. God's with him. There's examples in the next verse. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. But even in just being faithful to their diet, to the food, they didn't want to eat the unclean food. Daniel wouldn't even go there. So it's no surprise that, later on in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar had made a golden image of himself. And they passed a law that you had to worship the image. Well, as we know, Daniel and his friends, the other three, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they weren't going to have it. They just knew that they weren't going to do that. And Nebuchadnezzar heard of it. Of course, there was some troublemakers trying to get him in trouble. Nebuchadnezzar heard of it. But Nebuchadnezzar actually gave him an opportunity to go ahead, saying, and I'm paraphrasing obviously, if y'all will go ahead and worship the idol now, then I won't have to throw you into the furnace. And of course they replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. That's a pretty big level of faith right there. Because they just knew that whatever needed to happen was going to happen. Whether it be that God's hand literally saved them from the furnace, or even if it did not, they knew that they were going to be where they needed to be. And interestingly enough, throughout this act, as we know throughout the rest of the account, that they fell into the furnace, and the furnace was so hot that it slew the men that carried them to it. But in this happening, it actually multiplied Nebuchadnezzar's faith to the point that Nebuchadnezzar basically decreed, as we see in chapter 4, the kings of all the peoples, nations, and men of every language that live on all the earth. It seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. And we know there's a whole account of Nebuchadnezzar having dealings with God. Because as we know, God raised Nebuchadnezzar and raised the nation of Babylon to punish Israel for their unfaithfulness. So it only makes sense that while hardly perfect or hardly what we would consider, or what I would think would be considered faithfulness, they still had an awareness and an acknowledgement of God's existence. Obviously didn't have the reverence they should for God, but we also see this somewhat with King Darius whenever, was that the Persians, I guess? Yeah, when the Persians came in and took over. King Darius, Daniel was serving him, and it was a similar situation. Some crafty men, jealous of Daniel and finding no fault in him, thought the only way they could get Daniel in trouble was to trap him somehow in his faith. And so that's what they did. They went to the king. They talked him into making a law that for 30 days you were not allowed to pray or I can't think of my words, but you basically weren't allowed to ask of anything of any other deity than of the king himself for 30 days. As we know, Daniel continued praying every morning, every afternoon, every evening. I think there's even a bluegrass song. Daniel prayed every morning, noon, and night. Well, as they trapped him, these men reported him to King Darius. And apparently there was something about Persian law that once a law was written, nobody could override the law, even the king himself. So the king was ultimately obligated to have to allow Daniel, even though it distressed him. Because we actually see that up in Daniel chapter 6, verse 14. Then as soon as the king heard this statement regarding Daniel breaking the injunction or the law, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. But ultimately, down in verse 16, then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you." The stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet rings, and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Then the king arose at dawn at the break of day and went in haste to the lion's den. When he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel spoke to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel to shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him. And also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime." And then, as we know, we pulled Daniel up out of the lion's den and threw the men, their wives, and their children into the lion's den, and they didn't even hit the ground before the lions overcame them and crushed all their bones. And afterwards, King Darius even made a decree. In verse 26, "I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions." So again, as we see here, it looks as though Darius even had a level of faith, so that he was pretty certain, pretty hopeful at least, that God was going to deliver Daniel. And was multiplied even more so after he saw how God spared Daniel. Again, not the level of reverence that probably should have been there, but same there, King Darius, God raised King Darius as well, the Persians, for the same purposes. He raised Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. So even people that are what you'd call a heathen, when they are raised by God, you still can't help but notice and take notice that God's there and he's having an impact on your life and your livelihood. And then for a couple of examples from the New Testament as well, we know of several accounts throughout, obviously, great acts of faith. But just a couple to hit on, we see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke the account of the woman that had the hemorrhage. I'll just go ahead and read the account from Matthew chapter 9, verse 20 through 22. This is when Jesus was kind of walking amongst the crowd. Verse 20, and a woman that had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she was saying to herself, if I only touch his garment, I will get well. But Jesus, turning and seeing her, said, daughter, take courage, your faith has made you well. She just knew that even just touching Christ's garment would be enough. She had that much faith in Jesus' healing power that even the garment would be enough to give her what she needed. And it was by that, as Christ said, it was by that faith that it happened that way. And then, of course, we also have the account of the centurion with the sick servant. So we see in Matthew and Luke. And I'll read the account of Matthew chapter 8, starting in verse 5. When Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, imploring him and said, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented. Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion said, Lord, I am not worthy for you to come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it. Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled, and said to those who were following him, truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. I say to you that many will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And Jesus said to the centurion, go, it shall be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed that very moment. So the centurion, even coming up to Christ, knew that all Christ had to do was say the word. He didn't need to place his hands on him, and that the act would be carried out. And as I was kind of talking about at the beginning, I feel like, faith it's more of a feeling, it's more of a conviction, it's not as much as just a feeling, not as much just a conviction, it's more of a muscle. The more we work it, the more we exercise it, the more it just becomes second nature, something that we don't even really have to think about. We obviously always know God's there. We think about God often. At least we should. We should constantly be thinking about God. We should constantly be in prayer. And the more we are in Him and with Him and work on our faith, the more it will just become a part of us to the point that we don't even really have to think about it in the sense of the term think, but we'll just be doing it. So if there's any needs in the congregation, please come forward. We can pray or offer assurances in any way as we stand and sing our invitation.